Conrad Black, Baron Black of Cross Harbour, KSG, is a Canadian-born British former newspaper publisher and author. He is a non-affiliated life peer. Black controlled Hollinger International, once the world's third-largest English-language newspaper empire, which published the Daily Telegraph, Chicago Sun-Times, the Jerusalem Post, National Post, and hundreds of community newspapers in North America, before he was fired by the board of Hollinger in 2004. In 2004, a shareholder-initiated prosecution of Black began in the United States. Over $80 million in assets were alleged to have been improperly taken and/or spent by Black. He was convicted of 3 counts of fraud and 1 count of obstruction of justice in a U.S. court in 2007 and sentenced to 6.5 years imprisonment. In 2011, 2 of the charges were overturned on appeal and he was re-sentenced to 42 months in prison on 1 count of mail fraud and 1 count of obstruction of justice. Black was released on the 4th of May 2012, after serving a total of 37 months in prison. Early life and family. Black was born in Montreal, Quebec, Canada, to a wealthy family originally from Winnipeg, Manitoba. His father, George Montagu Black Jr., C.A., was the president of Canadian Breeze Limited, an international brewing conglomerate that had earlier absorbed Winnipeg Breeze. Conrad Black's mother was the former Jean Elizabeth Riley, a daughter of Conrad Stevenson Riley, whose father founded the Great West Life Assurance Company, and a great-granddaughter of and early co-owner of the Daily Telegraph. Biographer George Toombs said of Black's motivations, "He was born into a very large family of athletic, handsome people. He wasn't particularly athletic or handsome like they were, so he developed a different skill, wordplay, which he practiced a lot with his father." Black has written that his father was cultured, humorous, and that his mother was a natural, convivial, and altogether virtuous person. Of his older brother George Montagu Black III, Black has written that he was one of the greatest natural athletes I have known, and that though generally more sociable than I was, he was never a cad or even inconstant, or ever an ungenerous friend or less than a gentleman. Education. Black was first educated at Upper Canada College, during which time, at age 8, he invested his life savings of $60 in 1 share of General Motors. 6 years later, according to Tom Bauer's biography Dancing on the Edge, he was expelled from UCC for selling stolen exam papers. He then attended Trinity College School, where he lasted less than a year, being expelled for insubordinate behavior. Black eventually graduated from a small, now defunct, private school in Toronto called Thornton Hall, continuing on to post-secondary education at Carleton University. He attended Toronto's Osgoode Hall Law School of York University, but his studies ended after he failed his first-year exams. He completed a law degree at Université Laval, and in 1973 completed a Master of Arts degree in history at McGill University. Black's thesis, later published as a biography, was on Quebec Premier Maurice Duplessis. Black had been granted access to Duplessis' papers, housed in Duplessis' former residence in Trois-Rivières, which included figures from the famous Union Nationale Caisse Electorale, a copy of the Leader of the Opposition's tax returns, gossip from bishops, as well as historically significant letters from Cardinal Jean-Marie Rodrigue Villeneuve, side by side with handwritten, ungrammatical requests for jobs with the Quebec Liquor Board, unpaid bills, the returns of his ministers who were cheating on the taxes, a number of scribbled notes for assembly speeches, tidbits of political espionage, compromising photographs, a ledger listing the political contributions of every tavern keeper in the province. Black subsequently had the principal editorial items from the papers copied and microfilmed, and donated copies to McGill, York, and Windsor universities. Marriages. Black's first marriage was in 1978 to Joanna Hishan of Montreal, who worked as a secretary in his brother Montague's brokerage office. The couple had 2 sons and a daughter. They separated in 1991. Their divorce was finalized in 1992. That same year, Black married British-born journalist Barbara Amiel. Black flattered Amiel, describing her variously as beautiful, brilliant, ideologically a robust spirit, and chic, humorous and preternaturally sexy. Courtroom evidence revealed that the couple exchanged over 11,000 emails. In a February 2011 public Valentine greeting, Black wrote, "I have been persecuted and Barbara was under no obligation to share fully in the life-enhancing and undoubtedly character-building experience of sharing that fate with me completely. But she has, and no one can know, and it is beyond my power adequately to express here, what her constancy has meant to me. For more than 4 years before one was sent to prison, she toiled with me against the heavy odds generated by the legal and media onslaught. She endured an avalanche of abuse directed at her as extravagant, flaky, apt to bolt, domineering, and what Kafka called nameless crimes. For the next 29 months, she led a lonely life in Florida, in a climate that aggravated her medical problems, and once or twice every week, she got up at 3 a.m. to drive over 4 hours to see me. Religion. My family, Black wrote in 2009, was divided between atheism and agnosticism, and I followed rather unthinkingly and inactively in those paths into my 20s. By his early 30s he no longer had any confidence in the non-existence of God. Thereafter, he approached Rome at a snail's pace and began to study the writings of Roman Catholic thinkers such as St. Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, Cardinal Newman, and Jacques Maritain. Having accepted the possibility of miracles and thus of the resurrection of Christ, Black was received into the Roman Catholic Church on the 18th of June 1986 by Cardinal Gerald Emmett Carter, Archbishop of Toronto. Black would develop a close friendship with Carter and rely on him as a spiritual advisor. On Carter's death, Black wrote, "In the 25 years I knew him, his judgment and personality were always sober but never solemn, and never, not at his most beleaguered and not on the verge of death, did he show a trace of despair. He was intellectual but practical, spiritual but not sanctimonious, a utopian, proud but never arrogant. He must have had faults, but I never detected any. He was a great man, yet the salt of the earth." In 2001, Black was invested as a Knight of the Order of St. Gregory the Great, a papal order of chivalry. He has written that his faith helped him endure his imprisonment in the United States. Black is also a major shareholder in the Catholic Herald, and was the vice president of Paul Emile Cardinal Ledger's charity for a number of years. Career. Black became involved in a number of businesses, mainly publishing newspapers, and briefly in mining. In 1966, Black bought his first newspaper, the Eastern Townships Advertiser in Quebec. Following the foundation as an investment vehicle of the Ravelston Corporation by the Black family in 1969, Black, together with friends David Radler and Peter G. White, purchased and operated the Sherbrooke Record, the small English-language daily in Sherbrooke, Quebec. In 1971, the three formed Sterling Newspapers Limited, a holding company that would acquire several other small Canadian regional newspapers. Corporate ownership through holding companies. George Black died in June 1976, leaving Conrad Black and his older brother, Montague, a 22.4% stake in Ravelston Corporation. which by then owned 61% voting control of Argus Corporation, an influential holding company in Canada. Argus controlled large stakes in 7 Canadian corporations: Labrador Mining, Noranda Mines, Hollinger Mines, Standard Broadcasting, Dominion Stores, Domtar and Massey Ferguson. In 1977, Black became a director of the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce. Through his father's holdings in Ravelston, Black gained early association with 2 of Canada's most prominent businessmen, Bud McDougall and E. P. Taylor, president and founder of Argus respectively. Following McDougall's death in 1978, Black paid $30 million to take control of Ravelston and thereby control of Toronto-based Argus. This arrangement resulted in accusations that Black had taken advantage of the widows of Ravelston directors McDougall and Eric Phillips. Though these accusations were never proven, interviews with the widows in the retirement homes in Florida were aired the 21st of September 1980 in the episode of the CBC's A Canadian Establishment, entitled 10 Toronto Street. This program is still available through the National Film Board of Canada Library. This episode covered the period during which Conrad Black became chairman of Argus Corporation following the death of John A. Bud McDougall. Patrick Watson, the host and narrator of series, interviewed the 2 widows in the Florida retirement homes. Black, for his part, recorded that the widows understood and approved every letter of every word of the agreement. Other observers admired Black for marshalling enough investor support to win control without committing a large block of personal assets. Some of the Argus assets were already troubled, and others did not fit Black's long-term vision. Black resigned as chairman of Massey Ferguson Company in 1979, after which Argus donated its shares to the employees' pension funds. Hollinger Mines was then turned into a holding company that initially focused on resource-based businesses. In 1981, Norson Energy, one of his companies, acquired a minority position in Ohio-based Hannah Mining Co. In a filing with the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, a disclosure was made to the effect that Norson took an investment position in Hannah. The filing did not include a disclosure that Norson's board planned to seek majority control. Black subsequently was charged by the SEC with filing misleading public statements. These charges were later withdrawn. Dominion pension dispute. In 1984, Black withdrew over $56 million from the Dominion Workers' Pension Plan surplus without consulting plan members. The firm said it considered the surplus the rightful property of the employer. The Dominion Union complained, a public outcry ensued, and the case went to court. The Supreme Court of Ontario ruled against the company, and ordered the company to return the money to the pension fund, claiming that though the most recent language in the plan suggested the employer had ownership of the surplus, the original intention was to keep the surplus in the plan to increase members' benefits. Eventually, the pension dispute was settled in equal shares between the shareholders and the plan members. Industrial holdings shifted to publishing. Over time, Black focused formerly diverse activities of his companies on newspaper publishing. Argus Corporation, once Canada's most important conglomerate, divested itself of interests in manufacturing, mining, retailing, banking, and broadcasting. Canadian writer John Ralston Saul argued in 2008 Lord Black was never a real capitalist because he never created wealth, only dismantled wealth. His career has been largely about stripping corporations, destroying them. Journalist and writer George Jonas, the former husband of Black's wife Barbara Amiel, contends that Hollinger made its investors billions. Growth and divestment of press holdings. In 1985, Andrew Knight, then editor of The Economist, asked Black to invest in the ailing Telegraph Group, and Black was able to gain control of the group for £30 million. By this investment, Black made his first entry into British press ownership. 5 years later, he bought the Jerusalem Post, and by 1990, his companies ran over 400 newspaper titles in North America, the majority of them small community papers. For a time from this date he headed the third largest newspaper group in the world. Hollinger bought a 23% stake in the Southern newspaper chain in 1992 and acquired the Chicago Sun-Times in 1994. Hollinger International shares were listed on New York Stock Exchange in 1996, at which time the company boosted its stake in Southern to a control position. Becoming a public company trading in the U.S. has been called a fateful move, exposing Black's empire to America's more rigorous regulatory regime and its more aggressive institutional shareholders. Under Black, Hollinger launched the National Post in Toronto in 1998. From 1999 to 2000, Hollinger International sold several newspapers in 5 deals worth a total of $679 million, a total that included millions of dollars in non-compete agreements for Hollinger insiders. Later in the year, Hollinger International announced the sale of 13 major Canadian newspapers, 126 community newspapers, internet properties and half of the National Post to CanWest Global Communications Corp. Hollinger International sold the rest of the National Post to CanWest in the summer of 2001. Fate of Hollinger. The Hollinger Group of companies was effectively dismantled as a result of criminal and civil lawsuits in relation to sales of papers and intellectual property to third parties, most alleging misrepresentation and some alleging false or deliberately misleading accounts having been presented. The costs incurred by Hollinger International through the investigation of Black and his associates climbed to $200 million. Black claims a significant portion of the sums paid by Hollinger International went to Richard Breeden, the lead investigator. After Black was forced to resign from the board of Hollinger, many of Hollinger International's assets ended up being sold at prices significantly lower than those contemplated by incomplete talks while Black was with the company. By the early 2000s, Black had accurately anticipated the decline in profitability of print media assets and sought to divest those types of assets held by Hollinger, before the value was irrevocably diminished. The main criminal sanction on Black not overturned is specifically one of misleading investors. Television host. Black co-hosts a weekly talk show, The Zoomer, which premiered the 7th of October 2013 on Vision TV in Canada. Since January 2015, Black has also hosted Conversations with Conrad, a series on Vision TV in which Black conducts long-form one-on-one interviews with notable figures such as Boris Johnson, Margaret Atwood, Brian Mulroney, Rick Mercer and Michael Coren. Lifestyle. Born to a rich family, Black acquired the family home and 7 acres of land in Toronto's exclusive Bridle Path neighborhood after his father's death in 1976. Black and first wife Joanna Hishen maintained homes in Palm Beach, Toronto and London. After he married Barbara Amiel, he acquired a luxury Park Avenue apartment in New York. When the latter was sold in 2005, the U.S. Department of Justice seized net proceeds of $8.5 million, pending resolution of court actions. His London townhouse in Kensington sold in 2005 for about $25 million. Black's Palm Beach mansion was listed for sale in 2004 at $36 million. In late April 2011, this Florida property was also sold by Black for approximately $30 million. According to biographer Tom Bauer, they flaunted the wealth. Black's critics, including former Daily Telegraph editor Charles Moore, suggested it was Black's second wife, Amiel, who pushed him towards a life of opulence. He cited her extravagant expenditures on items billed to Hollinger expenses that included $2,463 on handbags, $2,785 in opera tickets, and $140 for Amiel's jogging attire. Black was ranked 238th wealthiest in Britain by the Sunday Times Rich List 2003, with an estimated wealth of £136 million. He was dropped from the 2004 list. Black is a former steering committee member of the Bilderberg Group. Fraud conviction and Supreme Court review. Black was convicted in U.S. District Court in Chicago on 13 July 2007. He was sentenced to serve 6.5 years in federal prison and to pay Hollinger $6.1 million, in addition to a fine of $125,000. Appeals resulted in all the criminal fraud charges being dropped, resulting only in an obstruction of justice charge and civil penalties from the SEC. In November 2014, settlements were reached resolving all claims. As a result of the initial verdict, he was fined $125,000 and sentenced to 6.5 years in prison, serving a total of 37 months after two fraud charges were overturned by the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, leaving one fraud charge and one obstruction of justice charge, and the 6.5-year sentence was reduced to 42 months. The $6.1 million fine to the SEC was reduced to $4.1 million in 2013. Black was initially found guilty of diverting funds for personal benefit from money due to Hollinger International and of other irregularities. The alleged embezzlement occurred when the company sold certain publishing assets. In 2000, in an arrangement that came to be known as the Lerner Exchange, Black acquired Chicago's Lerner newspapers and sold it to Hollinger. He was also found guilty of one charge of obstruction of justice. The Supreme Court of the United States heard an appeal of his case on 8 December 2009 and rendered a decision in June 2010. Black's application for bail was rejected by both the Supreme Court and the U.S. District Court judge who sentenced him. On 24 June 2010, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled 9-0 that the definition of honest services fraud used in Judge Street Eve's charge to the jury in Black's case was too broad, unconstitutionally vague, ruling the law could apply only to cases where bribes and kickbacks had changed hands, and ordered the U.S. Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals in Chicago to review 3 fraud convictions against Black in light of the Supreme Court's new definition. As ordered, the court reviewed Black's case and determined whether his fraud conviction stood or if there should be a new trial. The Supreme Court upheld the jailed former media baron's obstruction of justice conviction, for which he was serving a concurrent 6.5-year sentence. Black's lawyers filed an application for bail pending the appeals court's review. Prosecutors contested Black's bail request, saying in court papers that Black's trial jury had proof that Black committed fraud. The Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals granted bail on 19 July 2010, under which Black was released pending retrial on a $2 million unsecured bond put up by conservative philanthropist Roger Hartog and ordered to remain on bail in the continental United States until until at least the 16th of August, when his bail hearing was to resume, and a date by which Black and the prosecution were ordered by the Court of Appeals to submit written arguments for that court's review of his case. Until the 21st of July 2010, Black was incarcerated at the Federal Correctional Institution in Sumter County, Florida, a part of the Coleman Federal Correctional Complex. Following his release, Black wrote a column for Canada's National Post on his time in prison. Black described U.S. inmates as an ostracized, voiceless legion of the walking dead. Black was to appear once again in a Chicago court on the 16th of August to provide full and detailed financial information to the judge, who would then consider his request to be allowed to return to Canada while on bail. Black's legal representatives advised the court that they would not provide the requisite accounting and would thus not be interested in petitioning the court further on the matter. It is possible that the voluminous amounts of information that would have been required for complete disclosure could not be compiled in time, or that his wealth would be unlikely to persuade the court to extend his bail conditions. He was under no compulsion to make this disclosure, as he had initiated the appeal for a bail variation of his own volition. His next court appearance, where he might reapply for permission to return to Canada, was set for the 20th of September 2010. On the 28th of October 2010, the U.S. Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals overturned 2 of the 3 mail fraud convictions. This left Black convicted of 1 count of mail fraud and 1 count of obstruction of justice. The court ruled that he must be resentenced. On the 17th of December 2010, Black lost an appeal as to fact and law on his remaining convictions for fraud and obstruction of justice. The 3-judge panel did not explain its reasoning. On the 31st of May 2011, the Supreme Court of the United States refused to grant Black leave to appeal his 2 remaining convictions, also without comment. The resentencing on the 2 remaining counts by the original trial judge occurred on the 24th of June 2011. Black's lawyers recommended that he be sentenced to the 29 months he had already served, while the prosecution argued for Black to complete his original 6.5-year sentence. The probation officer's report recommended a sentence of between 33 and 41 months. At the hearing, Judge Street Eve resentenced Black to a reduced term of 42 months and a fine of $125,000, returning him to prison on 6 September 2011 to serve the remaining 13 months of his sentence. On 30 June 2011, Black published an article for the National Review Online that provided his scathing view of the legal case, detailing it as a miscarriage of justice and an unaccountable and often lawless prosecution. Seth Lipsky, in an opinion piece for the Wall Street Journal that ran on 28 June 2011, called the verdict against Black head-scratching, noting that Black was found not guilty of the most serious charges brought against him. Lipsky asked why Black was denied a retrial by jury as to whether he had committed pecuniary fraud after the Supreme Court unanimously found that Judge St. Eve's instructions to the jury were incorrect, which led to 2 of the 3 fraud counts ultimately being vacated. In the end, 1 fraud conviction and a count of obstruction were allowed to stand. Black did not return to the Federal Correctional Institution in Coleman, Florida. On 6 September 2011, he was sent to a different Florida federal correction facility, this one in Miami. He was released from prison on 4 May 2012. while he waived Canadian citizenship in 2001 in order to receive a British peerage. He has expressed desire to live in Canada after his prison term completed. He was granted a one-year temporary resident permit to live in Canada in March 2012 when he was still serving his sentence. Upon his release from the prison, Black was immediately picked up by the U.S. immigration officials and escorted to Miami International Airport for deportation. He arrived at Toronto on the same afternoon and returned to his home for the first time in nearly 5 years. He has been barred from entering the United States for 30 years. On the 5th of June 2012, lawyers for Black moved that the last remaining counts of conviction be vacated due to prosecutorial misconduct and has claimed that he had been denied the right to have the defense counsel of his choice. Black's motion was dismissed on the 19th of February 2013, along with his request for an evidentiary hearing. Black maintains his innocence, likening the United States justice system to North Korea. Ontario Securities Commission. In July 2013, the Ontario Securities Commission restarted its case against Black and two other former Hollinger executives, John Bowlby and Peter Atkinson. The regulator is seeking to have them banned from trading in the province's capital markets or sitting on a public board of directors. The case alleges violations of the Securities Act. The case had been postponed pending the exhaustion of Black's appeals of his U.S. fraud convictions. The securities case alleges that Black and his two fellow directors created a scheme was to use the sale of several Hollinger newspapers in order to divert certain proceeds to themselves through contrived, non-competition payments. Black applied to have the proceedings dismissed on the basis that he is already subject to a temporary ban on serving as a director or officer of a public company in Ontario. The OSC has dismissed Black's argument and will proceed with the case in 2014. On the 27th of February 2015, the OSC placed a permanent ban on Black being a director or officer of a publicly traded company in Ontario.